So the last century has seen a major increase in the global population, and obviously more people means more mouths to feed. So in order to supply the increasing demand for food, agricultural areas have expanded greatly over the last century. So that's been one of the major changes. More recently, there has also been globally an increase in wealth across many countries, and that's often associated with dietary change. So people move from a more vegetable-based diet into a more meat-based diet, and also a more milk, dairy-based diet as well. And those changes in dietary preferences have also led to subtle changes in the types of agricultural land use that we see globally. So a shift from more arable crop production into either animal feed production for livestock or grassland production for livestock as well. So that's been a major change. The other changes we've seen is that there's been an increase in the use of land for bioenergy production. So not just food, but also for fuel, and that's been a major effect globally as well. We've also seen a major increase in urbanization. So there's been a global trend of shifts of population from rural areas moving into cities. So a growth in the megacities, or cities with more than 10 million people. And that's had major implications in terms of the labour that's available to produce food in rural areas, but also the expansion of urban areas is often into prime agricultural land. So we've seen also a loss of agricultural areas around urban expansion. Right, so if we look at this diagram, the diagram tries to show the flow of materials and energy from the production of biomass at source through to consumption by humans at the end of the supply chain. And what you find is that you have both inefficiencies and losses all the way through from the production of biomass to the consumption of food by people. And that happens at all stages along that process. So just to have a quick look at some of those issues. To start with, whilst we generate a lot of biomass from land, only a small proportion of that biomass, perhaps about 20%, is harvested and potentially available for human consumption. So you have a lot of residues which remain, most of which are recycled back into the system, so they're not, strictly speaking, lost to the system. Some of them are lost, so some residues are burnt, for example, in which case you have carbon emissions into the atmosphere, and you have losses of biomass from that source. But you also have different types of biomass that are used in food production. So broadly speaking, we could look at cropland area, production of crops, and the production of pasture. So pasture clearly is used to rear livestock, so you have a conversion of that biomass from pasture into the production of livestock and meat, as well as milk. So when you have that conversion, I'll come back to this issue a little bit later on, but there is a certain inefficiency in the system when you convert a certain quantity of biomass of vegetable matter into biomass of livestock matter. So that is an inefficiency which is built into that system. You also have, through that process, losses that come from transportation, wastage as biomass materials are transported around. And you also have processing losses as well as you process, for example, a livestock, a carcass. To look at croplands, again, a certain amount of cropland feed production is used to feed livestock. So again, you get an inefficiency built in, or the conversion of that biomass into the biomass of the livestock. But you also have other processing losses when crops are processed before food is delivered to shops where people buy and consume it. The other sources of losses in the system also happen at the consumption end, so literally people buying food and not consuming all of that food, just throwing it away. So the other types of issues we can think about here is that not all of the biomass that's produced on land is used for human food consumption, so a certain amount is used for bioenergy production, and a certain amount is used for fibre production. So for example, cotton is used to make clothing. So all in all, what we see is actually the total quantity of biomass that's produced at the beginning of that flow of material is much, much larger than the very, very small amount of biomass that's actually consumed at the end. So, meat products are derived either from the production of pasture, as we saw earlier, or from the production of crops, different types of crops. Grains in particular are fed to livestock such as chicken and pork. Most of beef, for example, production is pasture-based, although a certain amount comes from cropland feed as well. And when you go through that conversion of vegetable biomass into livestock biomass, you have a certain inefficiency, which is reflected in terms of a feed conversion ratio. So the feed conversion ratio simply gives the amount of biomass in terms of a quantity, either as a dry matter or sometimes as a protein content or an energy content, and how that's converted into the equivalent quantity of livestock biomass or energy or protein. And what we find is that there are very many different feed conversion ratios. So if you look at, for example, poultry, you have a relatively efficient feed conversion ratio, probably in the region of about 3 times of biomass into edible weight. At the other end of the scale, beef production is incredibly inefficient. So you might have 6 or 7 times as a feed conversion ratio for the production of body mass. But in terms of meat production, because you have a certain wastage, not all of the animal is used for meat consumption, it's about 25 to 1. So a fairly inefficient way of using biomass and converting it into animal protein. And the other types of livestock products vary across this. So pork is also fairly inefficient. Pigs are usually fed on grain-based feed, so it's the use of cropland rather than pasture. Some of the other meat sources, eggs are relatively efficient, poultry is relatively efficient, and milk production is actually a relatively efficient way of converting biomass into protein from livestock sources. So you have this different range of different components of the diet which have different feed conversion ratios. And one way we can explore the consequences of those different diets, because naturally if you look at the countries of the world, then there are different cultures and different traditions, which means that we have different diets based on the mix of those different types of either vegetable-based matter or livestock products. We've done an experiment to compare how different national diets, the cultures of different national diets, would have an effect if played out globally. So we've calculated, and you can see this figure here, we've calculated an index which is representing the human appropriation of land for the production of food. So what it does is we can take one particular country and we can make assumptions, keeping everything else constant, make assumptions about if the whole world ate the diet of that particular country, how much land would you need in order to supply that particular diet. And we've compared this across all of the countries of the world, but it's quite interesting just to focus in on a couple just to see how this would play out in practice. So for this exercise we can compare the diets of the United States of America with the diets of India. These are interesting ones to contrast because the US diet tends to be very high calorie consumption, so people tend to consume a lot of calories, but also they tend to have a mix in the diet which is very strongly dependent on beef consumption and also pork consumption. If you contrast that with the Indian diet, it tends to have much lower total calorific intake on average, but also a much lower, for cultural reasons, a much lower consumption of beef products. So we know that beef requires more land than either vegetable matter or, for example, poultry. So that means, in principle, the US diet is going to require a lot more land to supply that diet. So if we assume that every single person in the world ate an average US diet, we'd actually need about 98% of the entire terrestrial surface of the Earth to supply that diet. Now clearly that's not possible because 98% of the Earth's surface is not productive in agricultural terms. We call that tundra, rock, ice, snow, deserts, etc. So clearly it's totally unsustainable for the world to be fed on a US diet. By contrast, an Indian diet would require, if everyone ate an Indian diet, about half of the total agricultural area that's currently used to produce food. So again, an enormous change in our requirements for land, which would have potentially lots of other implications in terms of how we could use the land that's freed up from food production for example, reforestation, carbon storage, and these types of issues. So an interesting way of contrasting that. And obviously other countries tend to be on that spectrum from very high appropriation of land for food production down to much, much less so. So clearly diet is a really important factor in the area of land that's required to supply food. And that's something we need to think about when we think about sustainability scenarios going forward.